Go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Chelsea Swanson, project planner with the City of Santa Barbara. And joining me tonight is Jessica Grant, supervising transportation planner, and Greg Young, our consultant from Consor Engineering. Also, Erica Madrigal, project engineer, will be providing Spanish translation. And tonight we'll be sharing about the Lower East Side community connectivity planning effort update. For Spanish interpretation, please select Spanish using the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Erica? So why are we having this meeting tonight? Tonight's meeting is a follow-up to community meetings that were held in the fall of 2021 for the Lower East Side Community Connectivity Active Transportation Plan. And the purpose is to provide an update to the community on the planning effort. We'll first give some background information on the plan for those of you who may be hearing about it for the first time. So this image shows the plan area, which is focused on connectivity between the east side and destinations south of Highway 101. As you can see, there's approximately 1.25 miles between the Milpas and Cacique Highway crossings and the Cabrillo Boulevard crossing via Old Coast Highway. So this distance demonstrates how the highway is a physical barrier to walking and biking. Adopted a pedestrian master plan in 2006, which is intended to enhance the city's walkability, increase connections to destinations throughout the city, and promote walking as a viable means of transportation. The pedestrian master plan recognizes the highway as a physical barrier to walking and biking between destinations on either side of it. Policy 1.4 states that the city shall work to eliminate Highway 101 as a barrier to pedestrian travel. The plan also identifies a possible future location for a new overcrossing between this intersection of South Canada and Pito Streets and Dwight Murphy Field, as you'll see highlighted on this slide. In 2018, City Council also adopted a Vision Zero strategy that aims to eliminate all roadway fatalities and severe injuries in city roadways, while also increasing safe, healthy, and equitable mobility for all. The map on the right is a collision heat map from the years 2008 to 2017. A color on the map represents a collision in our roadway. The darker the color, the more frequent there are collisions. And what we can tell from our collision data is that pedestrians and cyclists are disproportionately affected on our roadways with respect to severe injuries and fatalities. As pedestrians and cyclists are the most vulnerable road users, the government shares a responsibility for safe streets. With these important plans and policies in place, the city secured grant funding through the state's Active Transportation Program to work on the Lower East Side Community Connectivity Active Transportation Plan. And this grant funding was awarded in 2020. And this slide summarizes the planning efforts to date. In the fall of 2021, the city held community meetings both online and in person at the Franklin Center. Online surveys were also distributed to the community in both English and Spanish, and community members identified needs throughout the East Side for improving the walking and biking experience, which will be captured in the final plan, And the purpose of the outreach was also to learn if the community still supported the city to study the feasibility of an overcrossing as shown in that pedestrian master plan. Following the outreach in 2021 and with the community support, the city worked with our consultant Consort Engineering to study the feasibility of an overcrossing. The study includes preliminary environmental and engineering studies and also design concepts, and we'll be sharing the highlights of the study tonight. Lastly, because an overcrossing would interface with other jurisdictions, the city has met with Caltrans and the Santa Barbara County Flood Control to understand those agencies' concerns and input for a future overcrossing. Before we get into the details of the feasibility study, just to highlight some of the input we received from the community during the initial public outreach, we did hear overall support for moving forward with studying the overcrossing and the location that was shown in the pedestrian master plan from that cul-de-sac at South Canada and Pito Streets to Dwight Murphy Field. Some people were interested in alternative crossing locations or looking at an undercrossing in the Sycamore Creek location for reasons related to safety, flooding, and impacts to the creek habitat. And undercrossing through the creek was not analyzed. We also heard questions about how the new infrastructure would be made safe and well maintained. And we received a lot of great feedback on areas for improvement for walking and biking within the Eastside that we'll address a bit later in the presentation. So now we'll get into the feasibility study, and the next two slides are really a summary of what the main objectives were of the study. They are to avoid or minimize infrastructure within Caltrans or Union Pacific Railroad right-of-way. The study was to provide 3 structural design alternatives and to identify site constraints like Sycamore Creek, the zoo parking lot, adjacent private properties, and ADA and accessibility requirements. Our objectives were to identify hydraulic impacts associated with Sycamore Creek, minimize right-of-way acquisition, or in other words, to keep the infrastructure within city-owned property or right-of-way as much as possible. And finally, to develop final design and construction cost estimates for the future project. So this slide is taken from the feasibility study, and it's really a summary of identified constraints for the project. It shows the overcrossing alignment that was studied, starting at the cul-de-sac, again at Canada and Pito Street, crossing Highway 101, and then running along the northern boundary of the zoo parking lot. And then, of course, connecting at Dwight Murphy Field. I won't go over all the constraints in detail, but I'll highlight a few. Purposes of discussion, there are 3 distinct frames that are defined for the overcrossing. We'll call this the northern stacked ramp at the cul-de-sac. The portion that goes over the highway, we'll call the US 101 frame. And then the portion that goes through the zoo parking lot, we call the Sycamore Creek frame. So for the northern stacked ramp, north of the highway, the main constraints are related to existing right-of-way boundaries. Most of the ramp would be within the city's right-of-way. However, there is a small triangular piece of property that is currently owned by Caltrans and would need to be acquired by the city. Other constraints in this area are really related to keeping ramp grades in compliance with the American with Disabilities Act, or ADA. The ADA limits grades throughout the bridge to 5% or less, or up to 8.33% with flat resting areas every 30 feet. There's also vertical clearance requirements for getting the bridge over Highway 101, which must be 18 feet 6 inches above the highway. And then also over the railroad right of, which is like 23 foot. Other really important considerations for this northern stacked ramp are impacts to the adjacent private properties and maintaining 20-foot wide driveway access to the adjacent mobile home park, and also maintaining adequate access to the RV park. And of course, just designing the ramp to maximize safety and aesthetics for the immediate neighbors. In the section that goes over the highway, the US 101 frame, the main constraints identified in the study are related again to vertical clearance over the highway and the railroad, and then short-term construction impacts to both of those areas, and also best practices for long-term maintenance. For the Sycamore Creek frame, which runs through the city's property that's leased to the zoo on the northern part of the parking lot, the main considerations are related to the creek and preserving riparian habitat. There is a long-term plan to widen Sycamore Creek separate from this project and to improve all bridges south of Highway 101. So this bridge design will accommodate for that future widening and anticipated flow of the creek. Other considerations in this area are related to construction techniques. For example, the study recommends no pile driving because there's sensitive receptors at the zoo and also in the riparian habitat. This section also would require some tree removal in the parking lot area, and there would be some impacts to the zoo parking. There would be about 7 spaces that would have to be removed. There are also some underground overhead utility conflicts. And then of course, we focus on how the bridge will tie in nicely with the Dwight Murphy Field renovation project. This slide shows a future plan for the Dwight Murphy Field renovation project and where the overcrossing would tie into. So we're working closely with the Parks and Recreation Department to make sure the bridge alignment fits well into this future design. Look over the 3 options that we looked at for the Highway 101 frame in the feasibility study. And again, this is the section that goes over the highway and the railroad right-of-way. The preferred option is called a single clear span configuration because it would have no support columns outside of the city's right-of-way. So in this graphic, it says if we're looking northwest, from Highway 101 with the railroad on the left side and the highway more on the right side of the frame. This option would need to be prefabricated steel, and it would look something like this slide. And based on our initial conversations with Caltrans, it wasn't favorable to have support columns in their right of way or within the highway area. So with this option, there'd be less construction impacts to the highway, a faster construction schedule, and the most flexibility with regard to aesthetics and what it could look like. The downside would be more maintenance because it's a steel structure instead of concrete. And it would also need to be slightly taller than the other two options we'll look at next. Configuration that was analyzed in the study is called a two-span configuration, meaning it would have two main sections, and there would be a support column for this option that would have to be in the Caltrans right-of-way on the shoulder. This option would have two different depths, you can see, for each section. It could be either concrete or a steel truss like the previous option. It would be easier to maintain in the long run, but less aesthetically flexible. Then the third configuration that was analyzed in the study, we would call a three-span configuration, which would have two support columns in Caltrans right away. It would be more aesthetically balanced than the two-span option and could be concrete for easier maintenance. However, both this option and the previous, again, would create permanent impacts to the highway and potentially more impacts during the construction process. So I'm now going to share some renderings that we have in the feasibility study, which show what the overcrossing could look like. This first one is a plan view. So we're looking down from above with the Eastside neighborhood at the top and the zoo parking lot and Dwight Murphy at the bottom. And here in alignment again. Another perspective would be looking northwest, sort of from above the zoo parking lot. You'll note in this rendering, you'll see these support columns that I had mentioned that would require the removal of about 7 parking spaces in the zoo property. And this rendering shows a perspective of the overcrossing as if you were driving northwest on Highway 101, just past the Salinas Street exit. So again, Eastside neighborhood on the right side, zoo parking lot on the left. This is a rendering of what the stacked ramp at the end of the cul-de-sac at Canada and Pito Street could look like. Again, the height and length of the ramp is primarily dictated by requirements of the ADA for accessibility. This first option shows higher railings. I'm going to show a different option in the next rendering, and we'd love to hear your feedback, the community's preference on what the preferred alternative is. So this is the same footprint of a ramp, but again with the lower railings instead of the higher. This perspective would be as if you're walking on the south side of the highway, so through the zoo parking lot and towards Dwight Murphy Field. And this perspective is from the entrance of the overcrossing closer to the Dwight Murphy Field, and as you begin to cross over Sycamore Creek. So the zoo parking lot would be here on your right and the highway would be on your left. This perspective is also from the parking area at Dwight Murphy Field, looking towards the entrance of the overcrossing over here, or near the creek. And then one more perspective from, again, Dwight Murphy Field, looking towards the overcrossing. Share a quick video that just shows a flyover simulation of what the overcrossing could look like. Now that we've covered the highlights of the feasibility study, I'd like to revisit some of the other input we heard from the community and previous outreach, and also some of the planned safety enhancements to address those comments, and also recently completed projects in the neighborhood. So we heard that the preferred existing biking and walking routes to get across the freeway, the Cacique undercrossing. However, some of the concerns were related to homeless activity and traffic, busy traffic in this location. We heard that freeway ramps, roundabouts, and railroad crossings are uncomfortable for some cyclists and pedestrians. Heard concerns about walking at existing highway crossings or near them, included the lack of lighting in some areas, missing sidewalk, drivers speeding or not yielding, and some homeless activity. We also heard concerns for biking at existing highway crossings or near them, included a lack of lighting in some areas, lack of bike lanes, sometimes uncomfortable sharing the road with vehicles, and a lack of bike parking. So to address several of these concerns, there are safety enhancements within the neighborhood that are proposed as part of the city's capital improvement program. We're currently seeking funding for these improvements, and if funding is secured, they're anticipated to be constructed over the next few years. All of the enhancements were also identified by the community through an earlier effort called the Eastside Neighborhood Transportation Management Plan. So there's some overlap there. Enhancements include new curb extensions at about 9 intersections, a bike-friendly route on Cacique, South Canada, and Punta Gorda streets, sidewalk infill on Alisos. Sorry, I should be pointing this out because I'm saying them. And then, of course, new safety lighting and crossings along. Then where you see the red stars, those are projects that are coming soon and are funded. And then you'll also see recently constructed safety improvements where the blue stars are on the map. So now that we've shared the highlights of the feasibility study and other improvements that are planned for the Eastside neighborhood, we'll discuss next steps for the planning effort. We will have an in-person meeting next Wednesday at 4 p.m. It'll be outside in front of the Franklin Center. We'll be there from 4 to 6, and we'll go over same information we shared tonight. It'll be an open house format, so you're welcome to stop by anytime during those hours. We will have Spanish interpretation. And then after wrapping up the feasibility study, we'll be working on finalizing the overall entire active transportation plan. That will require, the plan will have to go to the Transportation and Circulation Committee and also City Council for review and adoption. Both of those meetings will be open to the public, and we'll notify the public when they happen. If the final plan is adopted, we would seek funding likely in 2024 to implement the plan, which would be seeking funding for final design and construction of the project. If you haven't already, we have a survey online. You can go to santabarbaraca.gov/LECC. The survey is going to help us with information to put in our final active transportation plan. So please go online if you haven't already and fill out the survey. It's in both English and Spanish. Then here's our contact information if you'd like to email us or visit the project website for more information. We realize we covered a lot of information tonight, so please reach out with questions or comments. We'll also have this webinar recording on the webpage within a week or so. And we do have a recording from our previous webinar in 2021. If you want to see that, that's also posted on the webpage. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature or raise your hand if you'd like to be unmuted and you'd like to ask a question that way. And if you have any questions or comments for our team. Thank you very much for joining us. Ms. Grant, if we have any hands raised and you're muted right now, so you know.
We do not have any questions right at this point in time, so we'll stay on for a couple more minutes and then we'll check to see if there's if anybody has their hands raised. In the meantime, or while you're thinking or typing up your questions, we'd love to hear on how you heard about tonight's meeting. We use lots of mixed media, from as simple as signs in the neighborhood to next door, etc. Love to hear how you heard about it so we can continue to improve our community outreach.
I saw maybe one hand go up for it.
We do have one question, and the question is the design finalized? This seems like the perfect location for a gateway arch to Santa Barbara. It'd be awesome to have it more Spanish style. Other cities have amazing bridges representing the city.
So great question. The design is not finalized. We're really in the planning effort phase and the feasibility phase, and we're coming up with options for what it could look like, but it is not finalized. It is, I would say, in developing conceptual form at this time. Thank you for your input on that.
Yeah, and we do have our engineer, yeah, Greg Young again, that's available for any questions or any technical questions. He's our guy. And thank you, Kent, for the comment on exciting project, and thanks for your good work. So thank you.
And I think, Jess, there may have been a hand raised.
Yes, here's Eric Schwartz. I'm going to unmute you, and once you're unmuted, go ahead and ask your question.
Two things. The first one is, according to the map, it looked like you're going to add something to Carpinteria Street. Is that a stop sign or another bulb out? Or? And the second part of the question is, you've got a nice curve, which is important for cyclists on the north side of the bridge. But when the bridge intersects with the ramp by the zoo, it's a 90-degree angle, which is going to be a tough call for cyclists not running into each other or pedestrians. It's going to be a little bit of a blind turn there.
Yes, Eric, I'll answer the first question, and that's what's happening on Carpinteria. It's Carpinteria and Soledad is the intersection, and that would be to install curb extensions to, again, have better sight lines for both drivers, and then and that also decreases the amount of roadway exposure for pedestrians crossing the street. And then I will have Chelsea or Greg answer the second question. And let me know if you need Eric to repeat it.
Greg, did you want to talk about the angle?
Yes. Yeah, no, that's a good point. One of the challenges in design is the fact that the truss is prefabricated. And so we're trying to keep a curve off the truss. The cast in place portions, we can introduce curves a lot easier. So it's a very good point. The curves are pretty tight on the north side. We are planning on rounding that out eventually on the south side. I think the rendering just showed it squared off. So that is something that we definitely were considering. It is just important to note, though, that, you know, I'm a cyclist myself. We're not going to be able to take this thing going 20 miles an hour. You know, it's kind of a lower speed facility. You know, so some of the advanced cyclists are going to have to really slow it down. But it's a very good point. We need definitely good sight lines, especially with the fencing on that corner. And so that is definitely a good point that we'll be considering in final design. So I appreciate that comment.
Okay, is the I'm a little confused on the map that's being shown right now. Is that the north-south new bike route in the red dashed line?
The red dash line is just to show that it would be enhanced lighting along the corridor. That was something that also came up in the Eastside neighborhood transportation planning effort, and a lot of all the existing lighting in the east side was upgraded to LED lights. Those were the Edison lights, but we'd also like to supplement with city lighting to add additional lighting along that corridor.
So what is going to be the bike route then? Right now, you got the two new bridges. Is that where the purple is?
So the bike route right now for crosstown, you'll see it's more in the green area that's shown. So what's coming? I'm not sure. Can you see my cursor at all? I'm not sure. On Aliso Street, it would be the bike friendly street that's coming, and then probably in the next year, we're waiting on a water line replacement to happen ahead of that. And then the project will be back on schedule. Portion of the project's been constructed because it encompassed other areas outside of Alisos. And then where you see Cacique Street, thank you, Chelsea, for doing the mouse. That would be another like bike friendly, low volume street. And why that one's a good across the east side is because there's the Sycamore Creek, which is it doesn't go all the way through for vehicles on that street. So it's already a very low volume street. And then it's kind of a wiggle to get over to the Old Coast Highway and beyond.
Okay, so the north-south, what are the red stars on Quinientos and Mason?
It's just to show that the Elisa, we were trying to have a simple graphic that it's just that that basically that corridor will be upgraded to a bike friendly street. And if you wanted to see plans on that, it's if you went on the city's website and you just typed in Eastside Community Paseos, we have links to the plans with all the details for that.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And you could also email the email that Ms. Swanson had up earlier. You could email there, and I can also shoot you a direct link to those plans if you're wanted to see that.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Let's see. We have a couple more written questions that came in, and the first one or the next one is, does the city intend to reach out to residents neighboring this proposed overpass in order to speak to us about concerns, most especially for issues with extra foot traffic and trespassing near homes and decreased safety that accompanies that?
Want me to?
Sure. And then I'm happy to add to that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And that's really important. Now is the time that we want to hear from the adjacent neighbors and all of the concerns and questions. So that's largely the purpose of this outreach, is to hear from you and your concerns so that we can address them appropriately.
Yes, and we also, to add to that, we have met with the adjacent mobile home park as well, as far as for some issues that they're having on their property right now, and we're working together for solutions on that. Okay, the next written question is, thank you for this information. Concerns were for the homelessness and bicyclists running into people. And as a cyclist, it would worry me a little bit that people at night just getting out of work, having to take this route, that people may have some blind spots riding their bike, and people hanging around in that area. So what I understand, I think, from that is both like a safety, and then sort of the blind corners. I think, Greg, from the engineering perspective, can you address like the blind spots? I think it's has to do with the corkscrew, or if you address that part of it, and then we can add some additional information.
Yeah, so we're always trying to maximize sightlines as much as we can. This one's a bit more of a challenge because of where we can put the supports, and as I mentioned before, the prefabricated nature of it. So we'll look make sure that the code is satisfied with in terms of a design speed and a sight distance. And the other thing that we have going for us is that we're proposing a very open rail. And so depending on where your vantage point is, a lot of times you'll be able to look and see it's not like a total blind corner. I do agree though that the rail does need to be studied, because if you're looking along the rail and there's a bunch of pickets, sometimes that can create a pretty substantial wall for the sight line. So that definitely be something we'd be addressing in final design. And then we are planning on incorporating a lot of good lighting on this structure too. So in terms of the night concern, we're going to basically be lighting this thing up pretty well. So it shouldn't be much of a concern at night, but that is just the nature of the beast when we have all these tight turns is we'd love to make them bigger, but we do have some right-of-way constraints. And so it's kind of a bit of a balance for us on maximizing sight lines versus minimizing right-of-way take. So we'll try to strike that good balance. And it's good that we have this documented as concerns. We'll move it up to the top of our queue and design consideration.
Thanks, Greg. Any other questions? Again, feel free to raise your hand or yeah, type them in. Chelsea, if you could go to the page where it has the email in case anybody on this call has any questions that come up later, it's always good. I know for me, I always think of all the questions to ask after the the workshops.
Also, I forgot to mention, if you haven't already and you go to the website, you can click the subscribe button. And then anytime we have updates about a public meeting or anything going on with the project, you'll automatically get an email and you'll be notified. So that's a good way to track what's happening as well.
And then again, just to add for next week's format, it is an open house format. So a lot of the graphics that you saw today will just have up on easels. It won't be a formal presentation like the one we just had, but there will be staff available to talk with all the residents and just answer questions right then and there at the workshop.
And again, if you're willing to let us know, feel free to put into the Q&A how you heard about the meeting. If it was the city news and brief, next door, you saw a sign, we have signs out in the neighborhood we hope are effective. That just helps us know what's working best to get the word out to people.
Well, thank you. One person saw it from the city email newsletter. Others from various maybe committee board committees that are part of the city. Good.
Awesome.
Glad to know our communication outlets are working. Okay, well, I know that, yeah, everybody's very busy, and I just, again, thank you so much for spending your evening with us tonight. It's really appreciated. Again, if you can continue to spread the word, or if you have follow-up questions and you want to talk with us in person next week, we will be at the Franklin Center.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.